So last week after worship service, I was talking to someone, and he said that many people struggle with studying Hebrews because it feels almost like reading the Old Testament. Right? We are 21st century American Christians, and it feels like all of these issues with he's dealing with here about people wanting to go back to Judaism, they don't seem to apply to us. So why should we invest in all of this Old Testament stuff? I think it's a fair question. I was thinking about that more this week, especially because this week we're going to be looking at some of this Old Testament heavy stuff, and also next week. This week we're looking at the priesthood, and next week looking at sacrifices. So I think it's a fair question we should try to answer. I think we can address it in a couple of ways. As Christians, shouldn't we want to know more about Jesus? Because that's what the author of Hebrews is doing here. He's really presenting more about Jesus as the solution for people who want to go back to whatever they were comfortable with. And we may not want to go back to Judaism, but we can tend to drift away into whatever sinful patterns or whatever worldly systems that we are comfortable with. So I think seeing Christ for who he is, what he has done, that's definitely valuable to us. And the next thing I would say is we shouldn't fall into this trap of thinking that the Old Testament is for Jews and the New Testament is for Christians. There's really no way to properly understand the New Testament without understanding the Old Testament and what God has been doing in the Old Testament. So the priesthood, the sacrifices, etc., these we need to look at as just shadows that represent the realities that we now see in the New Testament, right? And the other thing I would say is that as we look at the people of God in the Old Testament, their story is our story, and we need to learn from their examples, both good and bad. So I thought I'll begin with that. I hope that's been a helpful perspective on why we should spend time studying the book of Hebrews. So we're now exactly in the middle of a 7-week study of the book of Hebrews. And fittingly, the theme of today is really the central theme of the book of Hebrews, the high priesthood of Jesus. We began chapters 1 and 2 looking at broadly who Jesus is. When we looked at it from the perspective of, from the frame of reference of angels, who Jesus is and what he has done for humanity, and a very broad perspective, right? And then the next week we looked at Jesus in relation to Moses, Joshua, and Aaron. And during this discussion about Aaron and the high priesthood, he introduced this idea that Jesus is a different kind of high priest in the order of Melchizedek. And at that point, he kind of broke off, and this whole mention of Melchizedek probably reminded him of the spiritual sluggishness of these people. And then he broke off into the section of warning, and then he concluded that with some encouragement. That's what we saw last week. And this week, we see that he picks up in chapter 7 with this whole discussion about the high priesthood. And that's where we're going today. So the high priesthood of Jesus, and also the new covenant that is closely tied to the priesthood of Jesus. So before chapter 7, up to this point, we've already seen various times that Jesus as high priest has been mentioned. In chapter 2, for example, right, we saw that it was not to angels that God subjected the world to come. Mankind was actually destined to rule over creation, but we sinned and failed in that mandate that we were given. And Jesus stepped in, and he became fully human, and by his substitution, we are ultimately going to be able to fulfill that destiny that we were originally created for. That's the pattern that we saw in chapter 2. Now, in that context, he says, therefore, he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest. So his point here is that Jesus was fully human, and a high priest had to be taken from among the people that he represents. So Jesus is our fully human representative high priest. That's the first time this idea of high priest was introduced in chapter 2. And then moving on to chapter 4, here we saw the rest that Joshua provided versus the rest that Jesus provided, the eternal rest that Jesus provided. And in this context, he encourages us, let us strive to enter that rest and not fall away. But this is not something that we can strive and do of our own strength. And therefore, in that context, he brings this idea of Jesus as our high priest. Jesus is the high priest who has passed through the heavens. Just like we are going to be entering that eternal rest, Jesus has passed through the heavens. And he's able to sympathize with our weaknesses. So he not only provides a superior rest, he provides a superior help for us in our walk here. So that's the second mention of the high priest that we saw in chapter 4. And then in chapter 5, he gets into a little more detail with the priesthood of Aaron, the Levitical priesthood versus the priesthood of Jesus. And that section in chapter 5 ends with him saying that Jesus is a high priest after order of Melchizedek. It's a different order. And then he breaks off into that warning passage. Then at the end of chapter 6, he brings some encouragements and he points us to the promises of God. We have the sure and steadfast anchor of the soul. Doubly sure, in fact, because God's word and the oath that we're going to see in Psalm 110. So we have this doubly sure, steadfast anchor of the soul because Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever of the order of Melchizedek. So he brings this all the way back to where he started in chapter 5. And then he steps into this full-blown discussion of the high priesthood of Jesus in chapter 7. And that's where we're going today. So also we see in this that there's Jesus' high priesthood work in two ways. One is what he's done in the past, and then what he's doing in the present, right? In the past, his atonement on the cross, and entering the heavenly sanctuary, being seated at the right hand of the Father, and then present work of intercession and helping. So as we look at these passages, we see both of these. He made propitiation for the sins of the people, and then now he's able to help those who are being tempted. He's passed through the heavens, now he sympathizes with our weaknesses. He has been made perfect, now is the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. He has gone as a forerunner on our behalf. Now we have this sure and steadfast anchor of the soul. Okay? Alright, now we got this brief mention about Psalm 110 and this oath that God swore. Now it's interesting to quickly look at Psalm 110 itself. This is a Psalm of David, and it's actually a psalm, the psalm that is quoted most in the New Testament. There's two prophecies or oracles about the Messiah that we see here, verse 1 and verse 4. In verse 1, David says, "The Lord Yahweh says to my Lord, the Messiah, sit at my right hand." Right? So this is a prophecy about Jesus as king. And then in verse 4, the Lord had sworn, and this is the oath that's being referred to, and will not change his mind, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And this is Messiah as king. So we see this dual role of king and priest. Now interestingly, according to the Old Covenant law, a king was not allowed to be a priest. But here we see the prophecy of the Messiah being both king and priest. And so we already start seeing it's a new kind of priesthood, and it's also a different kind of a law that is different from the Old Covenant law. Alright, so that brings us to today's text, chapters 7 and 8. We can break this up in three sections. First 7 verses of chapter 7, we see about Melchizedek and how he points to Jesus. And in the rest of chapter 7, we see more about the better priesthood of Jesus. And then chapter 8, we see the better covenant that Jesus introduces, the new covenant. So, Melchizedek is this enigmatic personality in the Old Covenant, in the Old Testament, that we know very little about. It's really not that important to actually know a whole lot of information about him and discover everything about him, as some cults and some strange folks have tried to do. They try to come up with a lot of things about Melchizedek. The Hebrew author doesn't try to do that. But the point here is his significance in terms of how he points to Jesus. So, typology is a form of prophetic fulfillment in which God orchestrates history in such a way that some person in the past has certain characteristics that foreshadow and point to an ultimate fulfillment, usually in Jesus. So we've seen this many times. In fact, we studied this in a past study in Psalms, and then we'll see this a whole lot of times in the book of Hebrews. So here, that's what Melchizedek is representing. He's a typological reference pointing to Jesus. In Genesis chapter 14, we see this account of Melchizedek. There's just 3 verses in Genesis about Melchizedek and 1 verse about Melchizedek in Psalm 110. That's it in the whole of the Old Testament. And then we see Melchizedek referenced in Hebrews. That's it. We see here this historic account where the text reads, Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. And to him, Abraham apportioned a 10th part of everything. Right? Now, the Hebrews author starts highlighting various characteristics in Melchizedek that start resembling Jesus. First of all, he is both a king and a priest, like Jesus. And his name literally means king of righteousness. Melchi, King Zedek, righteousness. He's actually a king called King of Righteousness. And he was actually a king of a place called Salem. It could have been actually Jerusalem, but Salem meaning shalom or peace. So his name also means king of peace. Now, king of righteousness and king of peace. That's starting to resemble Jesus now. Then Melchizedek's eternal priesthood. He was someone who was without genealogy, having neither beginning of days or end of life. Now this starts getting a little tricky. Looking at this, many people have surmised that he could have been a pre-incarnate manifestation of the Son of God himself. That's probably not true, because looking at this text, it doesn't say that he was the Son of God, just that he resembles the Son of God. And also in Psalm 110, it says that the Messiah is going to be in the order of Melchizedek, not that they were the same person. And even in the next few verses, we'll see that Jesus was in the likeness of Melchizedek. So, what does this mean? Well, Genesis was known for all of these detailed genealogies, especially for people who are important and prominent. Now we see this really important person, Melchizedek, come on the scene really abruptly, without any genealogy or nothing, and then he fades off really abruptly without any record of his death. So the author of Hebrews is just pointing out that in a kind of a shadowy fashion, Melchizedek comes in without any beginning or without any end. And he really points to Jesus, who truly had no beginning or end. I think that's what this is representing here. And then we see Melchizedek's superiority in 2 ways. He received tithes from Abraham and he blessed Abraham. Right? In the Hebrew culture, a father was always considered superior to the son. So Abraham was superior to Levi, and Melchizedek is superior to Abraham. And Jesus, who's the typological fulfillment of Melchizedek, is superior to all of them. So his point here is that Jesus, as a Melchizedekian priest, is much superior to the Levitical priesthood. That's the point that he's making here through all of this typology. Now, getting into the core of the discussion of the priesthood, from verse 11 onwards, he begins by pointing out, if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, what further need would there have been for another priest to arise? So he's basically saying if the Levitical priesthood was able to accomplish its purpose. So that's the sense in which the word perfection is used here, the sense of accomplishing the desired goal, in this case of bringing men to God. Right? So if it was able to accomplish the purpose, there wouldn't have been any need for this prophecy that we see in Psalm 110 about a different kind of priesthood. So that's where he starts. That even the Old Covenant, the Old Testament itself clearly shows that there was a need and the Levitical priesthood was not able to fulfill the purpose. Okay? And then, under it, people received the law. Under this priesthood is where people receive the law. So there is a close tie between the priesthood and the law. Therefore, when there is a change in the priesthood, verse 12, when there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well. So like the priesthood, the law also made nothing perfect, as we see in verse 19. So in that same sense of not being able to accomplish the desired goal. He in fact goes so far as to say that the law was weak and useless. Again, in that same sense, not that there was no use for the law. Right? So therefore, a change in the priest and the law was required. And how does that happen? Verse 13, the one of whom these things are spoken, Jesus, he was descended from the tribe of Judah. Right? And he actually was not even qualified to be a priest, because according to the Old Covenant law, a priest had to come from the tribe of Levi. In fact, a high priest had to be a descendant of Aaron. Right? So Jesus wasn't even qualified according to that law, but he was qualified, as we see in the oracle in Psalm 110. Jesus was qualified not on the basis of the legal requirement, but on the basis of the power of the indestructible life. He was a priest forever because of his resurrection, basically. That's the flow of the argument that he is showing here. So, because of these reasons, the former commandment, the old law, was set aside, and a better hope is introduced through Jesus. And this better hope is able to accomplish, unlike the law and the priesthood, this better hope is the one that is actually able to accomplish the goal of saving people and bringing them to God. That's the point, I think, that he's making in this section. Okay. Moving forward, from verse 20 onwards, he gives 3 points of superiority or effectiveness of Jesus' priesthood. First of all, God himself has sworn an oath and guaranteed it, as we see in Psalm 110. So that's true of the covenant as well, the law covenant as well. So that's why he's able to say that Jesus is the guarantor of a better covenant. As we saw in the chapter 6, this is God's word and his oath, which makes it doubly sure. So what does it mean to us? We can be sure that, as we go through our own doubts and trials and all of the situations, we can be sure that we have a high priest that we can rely on, that we can go to. Right? Even as we sang today, when Satan tempts me to despair and tells me of the guilt within, upward I look and see him there who made an end of my sin. So I think that's what this is about, that sure hope that we have in our high priest. And secondly, it's permanent and eternal. He continues forever. He is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. Again, as we sang, before the throne of God above, I have a strong and perfect plea, a great high priest whose name is love, who ever lives and pleads for me. Right? And thirdly, it's about the character of this high priest. He is holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners. He is the exalted Son who has been made perfect forever. And he is able to effectively save us and intercede for us. Third verse of that same song. Behold him there, the risen Lamb, my perfect, spotless righteousness, the great unchangeable I am, the King of glory and of grace. I don't know if the hymn writer really thought about this section of Hebrews or not, but it seems to fit really well. These 3 points in this section seem to fit really well with those 3 verses of that hymn. Okay, now the Hebrews author began the discussion about high priesthood in chapter 5 and ends it in chapter 28 with that diversion in the middle. Now, it's interesting to see that this whole big section is bracketed by an inclusio, which is really 2 parallel statements, that one is in the beginning and at the end, which are really talking about the same thing. So chapter 5, verses 1 to 3, I've listed here, and then chapter 7, the last 2 verses, right? So if you see here, there's the same words being repeated, the same idea being repeated, showing this is the high priesthood of the Levitical priesthood, and then Jesus' priesthood. There's all of this commonality, there's all these parallels. But there's also some differences, the ones that I've underlined here. These are ways in which Jesus' priesthood is superior. So he doesn't need to repeatedly offer these sacrifices. His sacrifice was once for all. He offered up himself. And it was the word of the oath, this doubly sure oath, that appointed the Son. And he's been made perfect forever. So it's kind of interesting to see how the Hebrews author puts together this whole big section on the high priesthood of Jesus. Okay. Now, I picked up this table from the ESV Study Bible. There's just a list of the differences between the Levitical high priest and Jesus the high priest. It's fairly simple. Levitical high priest, many in number, when here 1. They were temporary, and Jesus permanent and eternal. They were sinners who had to offer sacrifices for their own sins, whereas he is wholly innocent, offers sacrifice only for others, not for himself. They had to sacrifice daily. He sacrificed once for all. They offered sacrificial animals. He offered up himself. They entered the holy places through a man-made tent by means of the blood of goats and calves. He entered the holy place of the presence of God and by means of his own blood. Okay. So just to quickly summarize, the Levitical priesthood could not accomplish its goal. So a new kind of priesthood is prophesied in Psalm 110. It's guaranteed by God's oath. Jesus, as that new high priest, brings a better hope. He is the sinless, eternal, exalted Son who offered himself as a once-for-all sacrifice for sins. And Jesus holds this office permanently. He ministers in this heavenly sanctuary, is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him. And he always lives to make intercession for them. And the law covenant is based on the priesthood. So when the priesthood is changed, the law covenant is also changed. Okay? And that's where we're going in this next session about the new covenant. So chapter 8. Now before getting into the new covenant fully, he begins chapter 8 with a summary or a focus statement about what we have seen so far. Right? Now the point of what we are saying is this. We have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord has set up, not man. Now he introduces this contrast between the earthly versus the heavenly realms of ministry. He's talking about this minister in this true tent in the heavens, right? Or tent or tabernacle. So the old covenant tabernacle and the temple were just a shadow and a copy of the heavenly tabernacle where Jesus now ministers. That's what we see in this section. Now he's picking up from Exodus chapter 25, where even Moses was instructed to follow a certain pattern, and the old covenant tabernacle was made according to this pattern. So he just uses that to mention the idea of a shadow and a reality in the new covenant that Jesus ministers under. So one word that we'll see in Hebrews over and again is the word better. Even in the previous section we saw there's a better hope, right? So the idea is that Jesus is better. And we see here about the heavenly sanctuary where Jesus ministers, which is better than the earthly sanctuary. And Jesus has a better ministry, a ministry that is more excellent. And he mediates a covenant that is better, which is based on better promises. Right? So with that, he then gets into the details of the new covenant. Now, he begins this in a very similar way to how he began the section on the priesthood. Just like what he said there, here he is basically making the argument that even in the Old Testament text, the weakness and the end of the Old Covenant was predicted already in Jeremiah. Right? So he says, for if that first covenant has been faultless, there wouldn't have been an occasion to look for a second. For he finds fault with them, when he says, and then he quotes the Jeremiah passage. And again in verse 13, we see that he makes the first one obsolete. So this is already there in the Old Testament. It's not something drastically new that the Hebrews author is now coming up with. So it's going to be a different kind of a covenant. So the new covenant is announced in Jeremiah 31 in the Old Testament. And this is a covenant that's not like the covenant I made with their fathers. They did not continue in my covenant. That's what Jeremiah says. And there are 4 promises of the new covenant that are laid out in this Jeremiah passage. First, I will put my laws into their minds and write them on their hearts. So this is about a transformed mind, changed hearts. And next, I will be their God and they shall be my people. We see here a restored relationship with God. Next, and they shall not teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. So the people of God are not going to be these mixed communities of believers and non-believers. They're not going to be defined by physical birth into a certain family or a certain tribe in Israel. They're going to be defined by those who are born again. It's not about physical birth, it's about being born again, and all will know the Lord. So this is a different kind of community that he's talking about, and a different kind of relationship that God is going to have with his people. And fourthly, I will remember their sins no more. So there's true forgiveness of sins through Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. Right? We also see here that the new covenant is made with the house of Israel. But as Paul says in Romans 11, Gentiles like us have also been grafted into that olive tree. And that is why when we come to the Lord's table, we read Jesus' words in Luke 22 and in 1 Corinthians 11, this is the cup of the new covenant in my blood. So we are able to participate in that new covenant because we have been brought near and we have been made participants in the new covenant as well. So let's summarize new covenant. First of all, transformed hearts. I've given a few references here in 2 Corinthians and in Romans 12 about how Paul talks about the law written on our hearts and our minds being renewed and so on. Then this restored relationship. I will be their God and they shall be my people. And these are some amazing passages about how even the Gentiles have been brought near, and those who are not my people at one point, Paul quotes this Hosea prophecy, even those who are not my people have not been brought near, and God will call them, they are my people. And ultimately this Revelation 21 passage is where this all comes to a culmination, where God himself will dwell with man, and he will be our God, and we shall be his people. And then they shall all know me. This is pointing to a different kind of community. There's a regenerate community. The people of God are no longer defined by being born into a certain family, but they're defined by their faith in Jesus, being born again. In John chapter 1 verses 12, but to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who are born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. So it's we are made children of God, not by physical descent, but being born again. And then we have true forgiveness of sins. I will remember their sins no more. There's a few sections in Hebrews chapter 9 and 10 that I mentioned here, and we'll see more of this in our next class. Okay?